Welcome to the Professional Investment Podcast. I'm Charlotte Moore, award-winning journalist and founder of Moore Square Communications. Each episode, we welcome a guest to the show to share their news story of the week. And I'm delighted to welcome Tim Manuel, Head of Responsible Investment at Border to Coast Pension Partnership. Hi, Tim.
Hi, Charlotte. It's great to be here. I'm so pleased you invited me.
Oh, well, I'm delighted to have you on the show. Do tell us, what is your news story of the week?
Right then, Charlotte. So this is the story that I've decided to go with. My story of the week is Donald Trump naming Chris Wright as Secretary of Energy, or as the BBC put it, because not everyone has an FT subscription, Trump names fracking executive Chris Wright Energy Secretary.
Yes, and that's really the point, isn't it? This man is absolutely in favor of fracking. So interesting implications, maybe. So why did you choose this as your news story of the week?
You know, I thought I'd start with, let me give you a little bit of background on him, because I think he is an interesting character. So Chris Wright was the founder and CEO of Liberty Energy. So they're an oil field services firm based in Denver. He's a self-proclaimed climate skeptic or climate change skeptic. He's previously said there is no climate crisis and we're not in the midst of an energy transition either. He's also a little unconventional. He recorded a promotional video of him and some of his colleagues drinking the fluid his company uses for fracking. So cheers to that. But why did I want to choose this news article just to make it just to highlight it? Well, for me, you know, first of all, this is a clear indication of the likely direction of travel in the US. President Donald Trump has been putting into place the team of individuals who are going to implement the platform that he stood on and the mandate that he was elected for. And why is this relevant? Well, I think the increased or increasing politicization, polarization of views on sustainable investing, it's not a new story. Yeah, it definitely grew legs during Donald Trump's first presidency. It's perhaps stabilized a little bit over the last 4 years, although certainly hasn't gone away. But I think it's fair to say that we should expect those legs back over
in a
the
more
next
muscular
few
version,
years.
maybe.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think some things that I think would be interesting for us to talk about off the back of this would be all the different approaches to regulating sustainable investing. Yeah, how do they differ? How have they developed? What's been some of the impact on investors of those different approaches? Perhaps some of the lessons that we've learned, and what does this all mean for investors like us at Border to Coast?
Yeah, well, let's unpack all of that as you've neatly laid it all out, a roadmap for the entire podcast episode. I can only just be a pretty figurehead now. I don't need to do anything. So let's start with that. You've mentioned that it had legs underneath Donald Trump, more muscular legs now, turbocharged by the Donald Trump presidency. And we have seen this politicization and polarization. So talk to us about how you've seen the environment develop in the UK, the US, and the EU, and the challenges that presents for professional investors like Border to Coast who are trying to invest on a global scale.
Yeah, it already felt like we were in a world that was starting to slowly pull apart. Yeah. Different views on sustainable investing and different ways of approaching it. Like you said, I think it is helpful. I think we should focus on the UK, but I think it is helpful to touch on the EU and the US first. The EU clearly has their more regulatory driven approach. Lots of rules. They love it. They're very prescriptive. There's the EU taxonomy, a very detailed classification system for what is sustainable or not. Then lots of acronyms, SFDR, their comprehensive disclosure framework for investors to evidence how their investments align with sustainable objectives, CSDR, another disclosure framework, this time for companies. But the EU approach is very detailed, prescriptive, often mandatory, high levels of accountability for whoever is on the receiving end of the policy. Now, the US approach is less developed. It's less prescriptive and more principles-based. It does have more of a focus on materiality, but more than anything, it's backed by enforcement. It's in the US where we've seen more of that enforcement action laid onto participants. Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, Invesco have all been on the receiving end of multi-million-dollar fines from the SEC. Yeah, and I think in the UK, it feels a little bit like we are sandwiched between these two alternate views of how to oversee how investors validate their approach to sustainable investment.
Which, of course, and you're not going to say this, but I will, is obviously a consequence of Brexit, whereas before we played quite a significant role in writing EU regulation. And now, in a way, you could say the politicization has increased, because what you described there is very much a reflection of the different philosophies in terms of the approach to governance between the US and the EU. And you can argue in favor of both, but one of the problems with the EU approach perhaps is you get too prescriptive and it becomes too narrow, and that kind of blows up. And maybe principle-based approach can be too loose sometimes. I know the UK is kind of tends to err more towards principle than very tight regulation, so we tend to be a bit more US mindset. But as you say, it's quite difficult for the UK because we're kind of stuck between two big competing blocks with very different philosophical approaches to this, even before we add in the politicization, just in the way they approach legislation.
Yeah, I mean, you can say that, and so can I. You know, it's we've given us. I don't mind saying it. You know, we've given let's say we've given ourselves the opportunity to forge our own path on this. Perhaps what we've realised it isn't as easy as you might think. I think we're confronted with some big trade-offs in how we develop our approach, and perhaps later we can touch about some of the consultations or the activity that's underway and how some of those trade-offs are playing out. I think the most interesting one at the moment. Oh, there's a few interesting ones. I think the one that many asset managers in particular are in the middle of is the implementation of SDR. So. Yeah. This is our version in the UK of SFDR, but we dropped a letter in the acronym. It's the UK's sustainable investing, labelling and disclosure rules. You know, in theory, we've had the opportunity to learn the lessons from the EU. I think that the reality of implementation is a little bit difficult. I mean, I've been talking to a number of my contacts around the industry, and I think some of the larger asset managers in particular are finding it challenging to really get to the bottom of what that means. I mean, since I joined Border to Coast, I've really had to get into the weeds of SDR. I really wanted to spend some time reading and understanding the requirements. It felt a little bit like a game of Cluedo. I felt like I needed one of those evidence boards up on the wall behind me where I could pin all the pieces of evidence and use some string to draw the lines in between. It's definitely not a linear read. Let's just put it that way. I'll be interested to see if anyone's come up with a good way of putting it all on a flowchart.
Or maybe some lawyer has managed that yet. I don't know.
Well, maybe, and I think it's interesting. Even when you read some of the commentary that's published by some of the legal firms or others, you can see there are differences in the way that those rules are being interpreted. But anyway, I think that's just one thing to contend with at the moment.
I mean, I think that's true. I think that kind of like maybe we forget because we're so embroiled in sustainable investment, and I've talked about it so much. And obviously it's your job, that we kind of forget this is still something that's quite nascent and we're still sort of figuring out the parameters. And that's maybe why things aren't that clearly nailed down and things evolve and change in a very rapid way. But I wonder if there's lessons there from how things have changed so far that we can apply, and this kind of fragmented world of regulation that we're operating in.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lessons learned. I think there's a little bit more to add to the background and the context, right? I'll try not to, it's almost impossible to have these conversations without using a ton of acronyms. So I'm going to apologize in advance, but maybe we can add a glossary in the show notes. But we've got the recently closed consultation from the FCA on public offers and trading regulations. This is, how to make the UK a more attractive place to raise capital, but without giving up the oversight and the governance that's in place. The Chancellor's Mansion House speech spawned a few more consultations, further consolidation of LGPS and the DC industry world, and a new UK green taxonomy. And then another consultation out there is the updates to the stewardship code from the FRC, and that's a consultation which is looking at how to capture best practices on stewardship, give investors good quality information, but not overburden signatories. But I think across these consultations, what you can see a little bit is the maturity of the journey of sustainable investing in the UK. 4 years ago, let's say, the answer always seemed to be, let's just do more disclosure, and everyone seemed to accept that. But if you look across all these consultations that are going on at the moment, then there is a big question that runs through the heart of all of them, which is about wrestling with the big trade-off. How do we disclose robust, reliable, comparable, sustainable investment information without creating disincentives to invest sustainably, right? No one wants to be buried under a mountain of rules. It can be crippling and it can be barrier in itself. So how do we disclose effectively but sensibly, right?
And that's made more complicated, isn't it? Because if we think about the two things when you're talking about sustainability and rules and regulation, we can think about, the stuff that ISSB, another acronym to stick in there, which is basically sort of taking on the job of an international accountancy style agency to sort of like come up with some rules that make all companies report sustainability in the same way. So when you're investing in a company, you can compare all that data. And then there's all this regulation that we've just been talking about, SDR and SFDR, which is about how you as the asset manager and the asset owner should be actually investing and what those funds should be selling and how they should be classified and all the rest of it. So there's that double whammy, and we haven't got an international standard on the company level, which is what actually enabled us to invest globally in the first place. And we haven't, and we never will have an international standard sort of for regulation because there is no global regulator. So it's quite a lot for investors to deal with. And then you add in the spice of polarization and politicization, and then you can see that regulation shifts a bit. You were talking before, I think, about how some of the sort of definitions have sort of rode back a bit and a bit less prescriptive than they were in the past. So everything's so fluid.
Yeah, and I think this I'm going to call it this trade-off phase means that we need to be able to have some of the more difficult conversations, but the concern is that the environment and the backdrop makes those conversations more difficult to have. I think that a good example is the stewardship code consultation. Even just among the group of my contacts and my network, I can see the wide range of views that there are about this. Just within the RI bubble, if you like, there's disagreement on what is more important than here. There is a change to the definition of what stewardship is, and some feel very strongly about that there is a rollback of some very hard-fought gains of the inclusion of environmental and social outcomes in that definition. Whereas with others, the dilution of escalation and collaborative engagement is more of a concern. And I do think it's, I mentioned that bubble. I think it's important that the responsible investment community doesn't retreat into its bubble as we try and deal with these. For me, it's much more important that this is a time of outreach. Yeah, it's not about defensive measures. And I think one of the, I started off this conversation, probably sounded like I was going to have a bash at the US, but I do think one of the lessons to learn from the US is that it's really important that you have solid foundations for your arguments, and the best way to do this is to build it on those grounds of materiality. As I'm approaching how we at Border to Coast are going to respond to the stewardship code consultation, one thing that's really important to me is I'm not the one writing it. This isn't something that should come from the responsible investment team. My job is going to be engaging all of the teams across our organization, especially the investment teams, so that what we can go back with is something that's really representative and workable.
So talk to us about that. So, we've laid out, I think, in quite sort of a lot of detail there about the complexities as you're trying to navigate this sort of shifting sands environment, regulations, standards, data, politicization. How does that shape what you do as an investor, how you advise the larger Border to Coast investment team and how they should invest sustainably?
I think one of the things that's been really interesting since I've started at Border to Coast, I've only been here just over a couple of months. Maybe by the time this comes out, Charlotte, I'll be maybe just at my 3 month.
No, this comes out tomorrow. So unless you've accelerated,
right, okay.
It comes out tomorrow. So unless you've got a time machine.
There's no messing about with you, so this is how you work.
Exactly.
All right. Well, 1 day longer than 2.5 months, maybe, let's call it. So when I joined, so the full name of Border to Coast is Border to Coast Pension Partnership, and I think before I started, I didn't really comprehend the importance of that partnership word within our organisation name. I think since I've been here, I've seen how the way that we work with our partner funds is everything to us. We think of ourselves as a partnership of 12, 11 partner funds who are equal shareholders in one organisation. But I think it's really that really puts us in a fortunate position. That relationship that we have with our partner funds means that we can have a really sensible conversation about the way we integrate sustainability in the way we invest. And everything that we've done has been possible without the intervention or oversight of regulators, and I think shows what is possible when expert investors work in partnership with informed decision makers. Yeah, I think some of the, since some of what we do for me that really stands out is, I think we've got a great net zero roadmap, and the way we describe that is, I think is really forward thinking. But I really like the way we talk about investing in opportunities and solutions. We've got around 8 billion invested in climate solutions through our equity and fixed income portfolios. There's a couple of examples there. We're invested in a UK-focused renewable infrastructure fund that invests in wind farms. There's an investment in a waste company looking to harness emissions from the decomposition of waste material in landfill. So there's 8 billion already there. On top of that, we've got our dedicated private markets vehicle. So this is the Climate Opportunities Fund. As you look under the bonnet there, you can see loads of investment in things like renewable energy, but there's some really cool stuff as well. We have a 100 million euro commitment to a clean hydrogen infrastructure fund. So this is a fund that is scaling up the clean hydrogen economy. There's a great example in there of an investment in the world's first large-scale green steel plant. So decarbonizing some of the industrial materials that feed into automotive and construction manufacturing processes. So I think it's great to be in a situation where that intersection of the relationship with our partners, our investors, the partner funds, and the scale that we've had and what we've built enables us to make these kind of investments.
And that's one side of the equation, right? Is looking out there for the opportunities, for finding the new technologies, for investing in the new infrastructure. And the other side of the equation is the stewardship. You mentioned the stewardship code is the stewardship part of the equation, because as Border to Coast, you have active equity funds, you have passive equity funds. So managing those funds, especially maybe more with the passive than the active, where you're invested in an index and it's about actually transitioning the whole economy and investing in brown companies and making them go green, is another area that we need to talk about and require. And now you talked about difficult conversations. That's one of the big difficult conversations to be had, isn't it? Because there is this constant battle between sort of divestment and engagement. And I know that as a public sector pension fund, you're kind of very much in the forefront of that debate.
As an organisation that is investing the assets of public sector pension funds, there is a high level of scrutiny, and with scale comes further scrutiny. I can't claim any credit for this, by the way, because this was published the day after I joined. So all the credit goes to the team and the rest of the folk at Border to Coast for initiating and creating and publishing this. But one of the things that, but I was really pleased to see it because so much of it aligns with my own way of thinking. We talked about some of the issues that we face in the industry around politicization and polarization of views, and some of the takeaways for me from that whole backdrop is, one, it's really important to recognize some of those differences in views and do think carefully and be thoughtful about who you're talking to and who your audience is. Mm-hmm. But off the back of that, it's really important to work from a solid evidence base and be really clear on your position. And so I was so pleased to see this piece of output that I feel like I'm taking ages to introduce, which was a paper that we produced called Divestment versus Engagement in the Context of Climate Change. It was a piece of academic work that was done in conjunction with Dr. Tom Gosling, really well represented. And my dog's coming to say hello, by the way, if you can hear him in the background. It was great to work with Tom on this because I think it's a topic which is important. There is a degree of independence in, taking a bit of an outside view. But it was also, like you say, Charlotte, triggered by the fact that many of our partner funds, our local authorities, they get asked lots of questions about their approach to investing and how they balance divestment versus engagement. And many of those questions are on the side of favouring divestment as a strategy. Now, our approach at Border to Coast is one where we believe that engagement is the most effective means for encouraging behavioural change at companies. And so what we did was initiate an investigation into this, a piece of work into it, where we really wanted to see what was the evidence out there that supported one over the other. It's in a paper, it's on our website. Please go and read it. In summary, though, what it found was the academic evidence was more in favour of engagement as a means to influence outcomes rather than divestments. Yeah. Which I think was a really interesting finding. I think on top of that, though, it looked at what does effective engagement look like, and in particular, what it identified was effective engagement happens when a few sort of circumstances kind of combine, and those circumstances are, there's the lead engager is a knowledgeable investor, the asks are really clear, and the asks are realistic and financially viable. What it found that engagement doesn't tend to be effective with companies when you are asking for something which is likely to not be in the interests of that company or its shareholders, where you're asking it to do something that is not in its own interest. Yeah. I think that really helped us in terms of how we think about the ways that we can be most effective at engaging.
I think that's really fascinating because it's basically what you've said is that there's a good dollop of common sense in there, right? That you need something that's strategic and clear and transparent. So I might say this as a communications consultant, you want to have your clear communication about what you want that company to achieve. And also it speaks to sort of empathy, right? And connection, and that you actually need to understand what these companies are doing, how they make their money, you have to be in the mindset of that manager in order to persuade them. So there's no good sitting back and seeing, for example, oil companies as inherently evil or something like that. It's not going to help you bridge that gap. And from my perspective, the danger of relying overly on divestment is it becomes kind of virtue signaling, because you can sit there and build a portfolio that is perfectly divested of all bad companies, but the planet is still burning around you. So engagement is an important part of that, but I also think that policy direction is an important part of that too. And I think where we've got to is UK and Europe being very clear about their goals to sort of get to net zero by a certain time frame, but we're less clear on the policies that are actually going to get there. And it's unrealistic, I feel, to expect financial institutions like Border to Coast to be the environmental policeman without any laws to help them out.
Yeah, well, I think what it, like I said, a really important lesson for us was, maybe I'll just, there's a term going around at the moment, systemic stewardship, which is sort of come out of nowhere in the last, which I think is just the combination of engaging with companies and engaging with policymakers in a coherent and consistent way. I think what this report really helped us with was, what is the thresholds or the threshold where one is more effective than the other? Yeah, and we can think about company level engagement being effective up to a point, but at that point it's where policy engagement really takes up the slack, where we need to see systems level change that is just not possible to implement on a one-to-one basis across those different companies that we might be talking to. So it's really helped us think about how we structure our program of engagement and the objectives and the asks that we will put to individual companies versus that we may put to policymakers.
I mean, I'm a big fan of systemic stewardship. I'm not sure that I personally would have called it that, but I've always felt for years that kind of institutions like Border to Coast and even the asset managers as well, who sort of provide you with all of these products and services, are kind of missing a trick. And I understand why. The financial industry got so badly burnt in 2008. They didn't really want to put their head above the parapet because they knew they were just going to have rotten tomatoes slinged at them. But, you have a lot of assets and a lot of potential campaigning power. And so I welcome very much this kind of first step towards, well, let's think about how we can actually make everybody's lives better in terms of trying to shape policy direction that it all heads in a sensible direction. I mean, I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, I think so. And just going back to the to that original sort of news story that we used to introduce this whole conversation, I think there is there's a need for everyone to just, myself included, spend time making sure we are being really clear in what we're asking for and of whom, because set against what may be a sort of backdrop of increasing kind of tension around these issues, I think there is just much more of a need to be really clear on what we're trying to do.
Well, I can't tell you how beautifully that was done, Tim. It's like you're an old pro at this. You've ended where we began. So I think that's an excellent point for us to finish our discussion. Thank you so much for sharing your news story of the week with us, Tim, and for all of those insights and that fascinating expose of how you think about sustainable investing and all of the trickiness of what you're dealing with. Listeners, I very much hope you enjoyed this episode. If you never want to miss an episode, make sure you hit the subscribe button now. Thank you again to Tim, and thanks for listening.
Thanks, Charlotte.